We talked about some of the metasimilarities between brains and computers and asked if these metasimilarities could indicate the possibility of creating hierarchies of description for the brain. To make a start on answering that question, let me go back to the caricature example we discussed earlier, and we saw that a computer created by a completely random process had some practical problems. It would need excessive information handling resources, and it will be hard to modify, build, or repair. Let me express that a different way. We can regard the existence of the problems as requirements that must be placed on whatever process is used to create a system. We can express excessive resources as a requirement to make efficient use of physical resources. We can express inability to change as a requirement to be able to add or modify features without introducing all sorts of undesirable side effects on features we don't want to change. We can express difficult to construct as a requirement to be able to build systems by a simple and error-free process. And we can express difficult to repair as a requirement to be able to recover from component failures and so on. So, however we create a system, the architecture must be such that it doesn't need excessive resources, and it can be modified, constructed, and repaired without too much difficulty. And there's actually another requirement that's an important corollary of resource conservation, and as we'll see later, it has a profound impact on system architectures. This requirement, called synchronicity, results from the fact that any system will be constantly processing inputs from its environment. Resource conservation means that it will often have to use the same resources to process inputs received at different points in time. Synchronicity means that it must be able to do that without confusing the information derived from inputs at different times. We'll say more about these requirements later on, but for now there are three critical points I'd like to make. Firstly, these pressures conflict with each other to some degree. For example, if every feature had its own completely separate resources, any feature could be modified with no effect on any other, but the resource costs will be huge. But the more resources have to be shared between different features, the greater the risk that modifications needed to implement a change to one feature will result in undesirable side effects on other features that share the same resources. So the system architecture has to be an adequate compromise between the conflicting requirements. Now, secondly, it's these requirements that drive the need for an understandable architecture, and more specifically result in the ubiquitous instruction and data read-write information models, the memory and processor subsystems, and the organization of resources into modular hierarchies in all systems that are designed under external intellectual control. And thirdly, there are some similar requirements for brains. There's no external designer for the brain, but natural selection generates some needs that are analogous with those that exist for electronic systems, although they drive a qualitatively different architectural form. Species that can learn a given set of behaviors with fewer resources, like neurons, will have a natural selection advantage over a species that needs more resources to learn the same behaviors. A species with a brain that can learn a new behavior without damaging its ability to perform all its previously learned behaviors will have a considerable natural selection advantage over a species in which there's interference between new and prior learning. A species in which the process for constructing a brain from DNA blueprints is relatively simple and error-free will have a natural selection advantage over a species in which the process is more complex. A species in which the brain can recover to some degree from damage, like injury or stroke, will have a natural selection advantage over a less resilient species. and a species with a brain that can use the same resources to process sensory inputs from a succession of different environmental objects without confusing the objects would have a natural selection advantage over a species that needs more resources or tends to confuse objects. So even for a brain that's the result of natural selection will favour not just a brain that can learn all the required behaviours, but also a brain with an architecture that minimises resource requirements in a way that still allows it to meet all these general requirements. There's a logic that demonstrates that practical considerations of these types and the conflicts between them tend to constrain the resource architecture of any complex learning system into some specific forms. It parallels the logic that drives the rather different constraints on systems designed under external intellectual control that leads those systems to the memory processing architecture, the instruction and data information models, and the modular hierarchies of resources. We will go through this logic in detail later in the course, but for now I'll just outline the major features of the learning system architecture or brain architecture that results from these constraints. In electronic systems, the practical constraints result in information processes of two primary types, a major separation between physical structures specializing in instructions and structures specializing in data reads and writes, and an organization of the information processing resources into modular hierarchies. In brains, practical requirements enforced by natural selection also result in two types of information processes, but these processes are qualitatively different from computers. These two primary brain processes are condition definition and detection and behavioral recommendation. And in brains, cortex-like structures do the condition definition and detection, while subcortical structures perform the behavioral recommendation processes. And these resources to perform these processes are organized into modular hierarchies. Now, once more, let me emphasize that there's no designer imposing these constraints. They emerge because natural selection gives considerable advantages to species with this type of brain architecture. And the key corollary of the constraints is that the presence of these information models driven by natural selection makes it possible to create the hierarchies of description needed to understand the brain in a way that's analogous with the way we understand very complex electronic systems. Just as for an electronic system, the common information models make it possible to map from higher level functions to detailed physiology. This slide is a kind of signpost indicating where we're heading in the rest of this course. You can describe a psychological process, such as recording information about an experienced event, at high level in terms of condition and recommendation processes. Then, at a more detailed level in terms of condition and recommendation processes between major brain structures. At an even more detailed level in terms of condition and recommendation processes between neurons. Then in terms of condition and recommendation processes within neurons. Then in terms of condition and recommendation processes in individual synapses. Then in terms of condition and recommendation processes implemented by chemical activation chains leading to the expression of genes. At each level, condition and recommendation processes are combinations of condition and recommendation processes at a more detailed level. So controlled mapping between levels is possible. So the kind of understanding you can achieve is similar to understanding of an electronic system or a physical science understanding. You can describe a complete cognitive process in terms of condition and recommendation processes. The description is approximate to some degree, but it can be made more precise by mapping to a more detailed level. The mapping is made possible by the common information paradigms. A human brain can only follow a small part of a cognitive process at a more detailed level. However, we know when and how to move between levels, so we can achieve a satisfying, intuitive understanding of how physiology results in cognition. In the rest of this course, we'll review how this works in detail. But the next steps will be to review a range of cognitive phenomena and then a range of neuroanatomical knowledge through which the cognitive phenomena can be understood. So this is what we're aiming to create: a hierarchy of description linking psychology to anatomy and physiology. But first, we need to discuss the psychology, the anatomy, and the physiology that we're trying to relate to each other.